Imagine standing in Istanbul in 1453, watching Mehmed the Conqueror parade through the streets after capturing Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire is at the beginning of an extraordinary rise. It will grow to control 3 continents, dominate the Mediterranean and Black Sea, control the most important trade routes between East and West, and become one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in world history. And now imagine jumping forward to 1875, just 422 years later, and the Ottoman Empire is literally bankrupt, unable to pay its debts, forced to hand over control of its finances to European bankers, stripped of sovereignty, humiliated on the world stage, and beginning the terminal decline that will end with its complete dissolution after World War I. And this collapse wasn't because of military defeat, at least not primarily. The Ottomans lost battles, but so did every empire. This was a financial implosion, a complete breakdown of the economic system that had sustained the empire for centuries. And understanding how this happened, how one of history's great powers went from magnificent wealth to total bankruptcy in what's really a relatively short time, teaches us profound lessons about public finance, about the dangers of debt, about what happens when traditional economic systems encounter modern global capitalism, and about how financial crisis can destroy empires more thoroughly than any army. Let's start with understanding Ottoman finances at their peak, because the system that worked for centuries is crucial context for understanding why it eventually failed. The Ottoman Empire's financial system was based on several pillars. The Timar system, where soldiers were granted land rights in exchange for military service, so the empire could maintain a large army without massive cash expenditures. The Devshirme system, where Christian boys were recruited, converted to Islam, and trained as elite janissary soldiers and administrators, creating a loyal bureaucracy. Tax farming, where private contractors paid the government upfront for the right to collect taxes in specific regions, providing immediate revenue to the state, and customs revenues from controlling key trade routes between Europe and Asia, plus tribute from vassal states, booty from conquest, and direct taxes on subjects. And for a long time, this system worked brilliantly. It allowed the Ottomans to maintain military dominance, fund impressive construction projects, support a sophisticated court and administration, and project power across 3 continents. But this system had inherent limitations and vulnerabilities that would become fatal when circumstances changed. The first major problem was that Ottoman finances were based on continuous expansion. The Timar system required new lands to distribute to soldiers, tribute required new vassal states, and booty required new conquests. So when Ottoman expansion slowed and eventually stopped in the late 1600s, after the failed siege of Vienna in 1683, the entire economic model started breaking down. There were no new lands to distribute, no new sources of tribute, no new treasuries to loot, but the empire still needed to maintain its military, its administration, and its infrastructure, and the costs were increasing because warfare was becoming more expensive. European powers were developing new military technologies, professional standing armies, and sophisticated logistics that the Ottomans struggled to match. So expenses were rising while revenue sources were stagnating or declining, creating the first cracks in the system. The second major problem was the influx of American silver into Europe, which might seem like an odd thing to identify as a problem for the Ottoman Empire, but it had devastating effects. Spanish conquest of the Americas brought enormous quantities of silver to Europe, and this silver flooded into the Ottoman Empire through trade. And basic economics tells us that when the supply of money increases faster than the supply of goods, you get inflation, and that's exactly what happened. Prices in the Ottoman Empire increased dramatically in the 1500s and 1600s, but government revenues, which were often fixed in nominal terms, didn't increase proportionally. So the real value of tax revenues declined, and people on fixed incomes, including soldiers and government officials, saw their purchasing power collapse, leading to social unrest, military rebellions, and political instability. And the Ottoman government's response to this inflation was often counterproductive. They debased their own currency, mixing less silver into coins, which accelerated inflation rather than solving it, creating a vicious cycle. The third major problem was the shift in global trade routes. The Ottoman Empire's strategic position controlling land routes between Europe and Asia had been a major source of wealth. But European exploration opened new sea routes around Africa to Asia, and these routes bypassed Ottoman territory entirely. So customs revenues that had flowed to Ottoman coffers started going to Portuguese, Dutch, and British merchants instead. And the Ottomans couldn't do much about this because they weren't a major naval power in the open oceans. Their strength was in the Mediterranean and Black Sea, and gradually, over the 1600s and 1700s, the Ottoman Empire went from being at the center of global trade networks to being increasingly peripheral, which had enormous economic consequences. The wealth that had sustained the empire was literally flowing around them rather than through them. Now let's talk about how the Ottoman government tried to adapt to these challenges. Because they weren't passive, they implemented reforms, they tried new approaches, but many of these attempts either failed or made things worse. One major change was the increasing reliance on tax farming. And this deserves detailed explanation because it's crucial to understanding the financial implosion. Tax farming is when the government sells the right to collect taxes in a region to private contractors, called tax farmers. The tax farmer pays the government upfront, say 100,000 aki for the right to collect taxes in a province, and then the tax farmer collects whatever they can from the population, keeping the difference as profit. And in theory, this gives the government immediate revenue and transfers the risk and effort of tax collection to private parties. But in practice, it created massive problems. Tax farmers, motivated by profit and holding short-term contracts, would squeeze populations as hard as possible, creating resentment and sometimes rebellion. They had no incentive to support long-term economic development because they wouldn't benefit from it, and wealthy individuals started accumulating multiple tax farming contracts, becoming essentially a class of oligarchs who controlled regional economies and could pressure the central government. So tax farming, while providing short-term revenue, undermined long-term economic health and centralized power. The Janissaries, who had been the elite military force of the empire, became another major problem. By the 1700s, the Janissary Corps had become hereditary, corrupt, and resistant to reform. They weren't the disciplined elite force they once were, but they were still politically powerful and expensive to maintain. And they violently resisted any attempts to modernize the military or reduce their privileges. So the Ottoman government was stuck paying for a military force that was increasingly obsolete and obstructionist, but couldn't afford to disband them because they might rebel. And this situation persisted until 1826, when Sultan Mahmud II finally abolished the Janissary Corps in what's called the Auspicious Incident. But by then, the military had fallen far behind European standards and required massive investment to modernize. The 1700s saw the Ottomans increasingly on the defensive militarily, losing wars to Russia, Austria, and other European powers, and these military defeats had direct financial consequences. Lost territory meant lost tax revenue. Indemnities paid to victorious enemies drained the treasury, and the need to modernize the military to compete with European powers required enormous expenses. And here's where we start to see the beginning of the debt spiral that would eventually bankrupt the empire. The Ottoman government needed money to modernize and defend itself, but it didn't have the revenues to pay for this, so it started borrowing, initially from domestic sources. Wealthy merchants and officials would loan money to the government. But by the early 1800s, domestic credit sources were exhausted, and the Ottomans turned to European banks. The first major Ottoman foreign loan was in 1854, during the Crimean War. The empire borrowed from British and French banks to finance its war against Russia. And this loan was significant not just for its size, but because it marked the beginning of European financial involvement in Ottoman finances. And once that door was opened, it never closed. The terms of these loans were often unfavorable. Interest rates were high, and various fees and commissions meant the Ottomans received far less than the nominal loan amount. But they were desperate for funds, so they accepted these terms. And this started a pattern that would accelerate over the next 2 decades. Borrow to cover deficits, use new loans to pay off old loans, accumulate more and more debt, pay more and more interest, until the whole system collapsed. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-1800s were an attempt to modernize the empire and solve some of these problems. And in many ways they were impressive. They modernized the legal system, reformed education, attempted to create a more efficient bureaucracy, and tried to integrate non-Muslim subjects more fully into Ottoman society. But these reforms were extremely expensive, building schools, creating new institutions, reforming the military. All of this required money the empire didn't have, so the reforms, which were supposed to strengthen the empire, actually accelerated the debt accumulation. And there's a tragic irony here because the reforms were necessary. The Ottoman Empire genuinely needed to modernize to survive, but the cost of modernization pushed it toward bankruptcy. By the 1870s, the Ottoman debt situation was unsustainable. The empire had borrowed extensively. Debt service was consuming an enormous percentage of government revenue. Some estimates suggest that by 1875, debt payments were taking up to 50% of all government revenue, which meant half of all the taxes collected from Ottoman subjects were going straight to European banks as interest and principal payments. And this was economically and politically untenable. The empire couldn't invest in development, couldn't adequately fund its military, couldn't maintain infrastructure, because so much money was going to debt service, and the population was increasingly resentful of heavy taxation that seemed to benefit foreign bankers rather than Ottoman subjects. And finally, in October 1875, the Ottoman government declared it could no longer make full debt payments. They announced a partial default, saying they would only pay half of what was owed. And this was the financial implosion, the moment when the Ottoman Empire essentially went bankrupt. The consequences were immediate and severe. European bondholders were outraged. They demanded their governments intervene to protect their investments. And the result was the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881. And this institution is crucial to understanding Ottoman decline because it represented a dramatic loss of sovereignty. The OPDA was controlled by representatives of European creditor nations, and it was given direct control over certain Ottoman revenue sources, including tobacco taxes, salt taxes, silk taxes, stamp duties, and others. And these revenues would go directly to European creditors before the Ottoman government saw any of it. So the empire lost control over significant portions of its own tax revenue. And this wasn't just financially damaging. It was politically and psychologically devastating. The Ottoman Empire, which had been one of the great powers of the world, was now essentially under European financial receivership, unable to control its own finances. And this humiliation fed into nationalist movements and political instability that would plague the empire's final decades. Let's look at the specific numbers because they're staggering. The total Ottoman debt in 1875 was approximately £200 million, which relative to the size of the Ottoman economy was enormous. To put this in perspective, this was more than the Ottoman government's total revenue for several years, so they borrowed more than they could ever hope to pay back with existing revenues. And the debt service alone, the annual interest and principal payments, was around £14 million, which was roughly half of government revenue. And this debt spiral had accelerated rapidly. In 1854, the first foreign loan, Ottoman debt was relatively modest. By 1875, just 21 years later, it had exploded to unpayable levels. And this shows how quickly debt can compound when you're borrowing to pay existing debts. Because every new loan adds not just to the principal, but to the interest obligations, and the Ottoman government was increasingly borrowing just to pay interest on previous loans, which is the classic sign of an impending debt crisis. The economic impact on Ottoman subjects was severe. Heavy taxation to service debts reduced living standards. Economic development stagnated because there was no capital for investment, and regions that had been wealthy declined as resources were extracted to pay foreign creditors. And this created political problems because subject populations, particularly in the Balkans and other peripheral regions, increasingly questioned why they should remain part of an empire that seemed to exist mainly to pay European banks. And this contributed to the nationalist rebellions that would tear apart the empire in its final decades. So the financial implosion didn't just bankrupt the government, it undermined the entire political structure of the empire. The comparison to other empires is instructive because the Ottoman experience wasn't unique. Egypt, Persia, China, and various other non-European states went through similar debt crises in the 19th century, all following a similar pattern. Traditional economic systems that worked well in pre-modern contexts but couldn't compete with European industrial capitalism. Expensive attempts at modernization financed through borrowing, increasing debt spirals, and eventual foreign financial control or colonization So the Ottoman financial implosion was part of a global pattern where European economic and financial power subordinated non-European states. And understanding this helps us see that Ottoman bankruptcy wasn't just about Ottoman mistakes or incompetence, though there were certainly policy errors. It was about a structural transformation of the global economy where industrialized European powers had enormous advantages over traditional empires. There were also internal factors specific to the Ottoman situation. The empire was ethnically and religiously diverse, spanning Arabs, Turks, Greeks, Slavs, Armenians, and many others, and this diversity, which had been a source of strength when the empire was expanding and could offer opportunities to different groups, became a source of weakness during decline, as different groups pursued independence or autonomy. And suppressing rebellions and maintaining control over this diverse territory was expensive, requiring military forces and administrative expenses that drained the treasury, and European powers actively encouraged separatist movements, providing financial and military support to rebels, which further destabilized the empire and increased costs. The role of European banks and bondholders in the Ottoman debt crisis deserves critical examination, because while the Ottomans certainly borrowed the money and are responsible for their debts, the terms of these loans were often predatory. Interest rates were higher than what European borrowers would pay. Various fees and commissions reduced the actual funds received, and banks often encouraged borrowing because it was profitable for them. And when crisis came, European governments protected their bondholders by imposing financial controls on the Ottoman Empire, but they might have done more to prevent the crisis by regulating banks' lending practices or by helping restructure Ottoman debts before they became unpayable. So there's a question about whether European financial interests deliberately pushed the Ottoman Empire toward crisis because a bankrupt but still existing Ottoman Empire was more easily manipulated than a financially independent one. The long-term consequences of Ottoman financial implosion extended far beyond the empire itself. The loss of sovereignty represented by the Ottoman Public Debt Administration became a model that would be applied to other indebted states. The techniques of financial imperialism developed with the Ottomans would be refined and applied elsewhere. And the underlying dynamic where developed countries loan money to developing countries, creating debt dependencies that limit sovereignty. This pattern, that started in the 19th century, continues in modified forms today through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. So understanding Ottoman bankruptcy helps us understand contemporary global financial relationships and power dynamics. The Ottoman experience also teaches important lessons about the challenges of modernization and reform, because the Tanzimat reforms were in many ways enlightened. They tried to create a more rational, efficient, equitable state, but they were expensive, and financing reform through debt proved unsustainable. This creates a difficult dilemma that developing countries still face. How do you modernize when modernization is expensive and you lack the capital to pay for it? Borrowing seems like the only option, but borrowing creates dependencies and can lead to debt crises that undermine the very development you're trying to achieve. The Ottomans never solved this dilemma, and many countries today still struggle with it. The final decades of the Ottoman Empire after the 1875 bankruptcy were characterized by increasing foreign interference, loss of territory, political instability, and growing nationalist movements. The empire limped along until World War I, when it made the fatal decision to ally with Germany, and defeat in that war led to the empire's complete dissolution. But the empire was really finished as an independent great power in 1875 when it lost financial sovereignty. Everything after that was just a long collapse. And this shows how financial crisis can be more destructive than military defeat. Because military defeats can be reversed, territories can be reconquered, armies can be rebuilt. But once you lose control of your finances, once foreign powers control your revenue and your ability to borrow and spend, recovering independence becomes extremely difficult. There's also a psychological and cultural dimension to financial implosion that's worth considering. The Ottoman elite had to confront the reality that their empire, which had been superior to European powers for centuries, was now subordinate and dependent, and this was deeply traumatic. It challenged fundamental assumptions about Ottoman identity and place in the world, and it contributed to the nationalist and modernizing movements that would eventually abolish the Sultanate and create the modern Turkish Republic. So financial crisis didn't just change economic structures, it changed how people thought about themselves and their society. Looking at the Ottoman financial implosion from a modern economic perspective, we can identify several key mistakes and structural problems. First, over-reliance on tax farming created incentive problems and allowed wealth concentration among tax farmers. Second, failure to modernize the military earlier meant the empire fell behind European powers and then had to spend enormous sums catching up. Third, borrowing at high interest rates to finance current consumption and wars rather than productive investments meant debt accumulated without creating the economic growth needed to service it. Fourth, lack of a sophisticated financial system meant the Ottomans couldn't efficiently mobilize domestic capital and became overly dependent on foreign loans. And fifth, political instability and resistance to reform from entrenched interests like the Janissaries prevented needed changes until it was too late. And all of these problems reinforced each other, creating a system that was vulnerable to crisis and unable to adapt quickly enough when crisis came. But we should be careful about being too judgmental, because the Ottomans were dealing with genuinely difficult problems. They were trying to maintain a pre-modern empire in an era of rapid technological and economic change. They were dealing with hostile European powers that had advantages in industrial production, financial sophistication, and military technology. And they were trying to reform while maintaining social stability and managing a diverse empire. This was an extraordinarily difficult challenge. And while they ultimately failed, they lasted longer than most empires in similar situations. The fact that the Ottoman Empire survived until 1922, nearly 50 years after bankruptcy, is actually somewhat remarkable, showing the resilience of Ottoman institutions even in decline. The story of Ottoman financial implosion is ultimately about the collision between traditional and modern economic systems, about how debt can trap states in spirals they can't escape, about the relationship between financial power and political sovereignty, and about how financial crisis can destroy empires more thoroughly than military conquest. And these lessons remain relevant today, because countries still struggle with debt crises, still face the dilemma of financing necessary reforms through borrowing, still deal with the power imbalance between creditors and debtors, and still confront the loss of sovereignty that comes with financial dependency. So understanding how one of history's great empires went from magnificent wealth to complete bankruptcy in just a few centuries, and particularly understanding the accelerating debt spiral of its final decades, helps us understand contemporary economic challenges and the dynamics of financial power in the global system. And perhaps the most important lesson is that financial problems can't be ignored or postponed indefinitely. They compound, they accelerate, and eventually they create crises that fundamentally transform societies and states. And the Ottoman Empire's failure to address its financial problems before they became a crisis is a cautionary tale about the dangers of debt, the importance of sustainable public finance, and the reality that in the modern world, economic and financial strength are just as important as military power, and perhaps more fundamental, because without financial resources, you can't sustain military power, you can't maintain sovereignty, and you can't preserve your empire, no matter how glorious its history or how sophisticated its culture. And that's the ultimate lesson of the Ottoman Empire's financial implosion. That money matters, that debt dynamics matter, that financial systems and institutions matter, and that no amount of historical grandeur or cultural achievement can protect an empire that loses control of its finances and falls into the debt spiral that destroyed the Ottomans, and that continues to threaten states and empires today.